Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to say, sorry, Deep, were you going?
Bolo Nainika.
No, just listening to what Aditya was saying, I looked at the project. We were shared this project in the landscape studio, the park and play. I've just put up a picture in the chat. Uh, I thought
Ah,
it was very similar to the inspiration that was taken by the municipal playground by Van Eyck, like how geometries are used for instilling a sense of playfulness, like how they move with the intuitiveness. I thought and this was done in 1950s. I think like how such an old concept was brought in place now, and I felt um, going from the conventional methods of playgrounds that we have and having such a place I thought was a very nice experience. So I kind of related these two projects when we were shared with it.
thanks. Yeah. I didn't know they were showing these but yeah.
Yeah.
But children look like an obsession, na, for these guys. For a lot, like when we looked at, there were schools and playgrounds, and even Herzberger made schools. This idea of playful, like we are all playing in architecture. So there's joy that they are trying to insert within architecture. Even if you look at the Habitat building, it looks like it's made of Lego or something. All these boxes placed one over the other. It's like as if there's a system. There is no larger plan, a playful thing that constantly is changing and evolving, that kind of imagination. Yeah. So Deep Bhai Kuch,
Yeah, yeah. Am I audible?
you're also Deep.
Hello? Hello.
Yes, you are audible, Deep.
Yes.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. No, I've been like out and in of the meeting like thrice and already. Okay, so one thing like the last lecture I would like to summarize it was more of like a simplicity. Like you don't have to create like some such complicated things. So all like even Aldo van Eyck and then the ordinary modernist style of the municipal and orphanage and all the things. So it is more of like how you can bring the interactions and community with a very simple things. And the idea of grid was there, like how it was used, and I already have come across this idea of grid, and actually had made up my mind that time that this is something I would not like to use. Like the architects who use like the grid is a key to the architecture. So I've come across like Hiromi Fuji. He's an Japanese architect, and I had a case study of him, like Todoroki House, which is also like house within a house. It is not now, like it is demolished, but it was just small area, and what he created was he strictly followed the idea of grid everywhere, and it basically felt like a prison after studying the whole house. Similarly, when I see of Peter Eisenman, like he does not really follow the idea of grid, I think, but his house 6, it is like intersection of many planes, I would say vertical planes, and just coming somewhere and intersecting. And so such houses like I have come across before, and that idea of grid is like way too complicated than the idea of grid which I saw in the last lecture. So I would just say that it is a more simplistic way of idea of grid, and it can be resolved in that way, contrasting with the structures I've already seen, which is too complicated to live in and to it's not at all comfortable. And then again, when I see Aldo Van Eyck, I really became like fan when I bang my head to create community spaces in the AD and IDS projects until now. And then he just put some geometrical objects in a flat land, and that's it, done. Like his project is done. The community gets it, interacts. So I saw his work not by name, but I just went through it like many other plans and things. It is like as you say, like it's simplistic in nature, than not like so complicated. Like Bernard Shumi, he does that deconstructivist thing, but kind of follows the idea of grid. But I really don't like to, when I see those structures, I don't feel like I would like to live in such places. So that
Yeah.
was like, I would just summarize a lecture by the name simplicity, I would say.
Fine, fine. We will come across Eisenman and Shumi later on this week. When did you see their work, Deep?
It was last sem to AD when I was studying Todoroki House. So I was going through Bernard Shumi and Eisenman as well, another
Right.
deconstructivist architect.
Yeah, we will be looking at deconstruction. We cannot avoid them in a theory of design class. क्या करें? देखना पड़ेगा. Yeah, but there is something soft about and easy about the way that the Team 10 full group, they were looking at architecture, and I think that is, I mean, there was a certain ethic, I think, in the 60s that really wanted to bring the human back into the center of the idea of architecture. And people as like, normal people, everyday life, not stylized people. Shiru? Shirish, breakup हो गया क्या Shirish का?
No, I'm here, Rohan.
No, I can't see you. That's why I got
I'm munching. Sorry.
ching.
In the middle of munching, yeah.
बोल कौन कोई somebody is saying something one day.
I was saying that last semester we saw Dutch architecture in a very different perspective, right? The more ornamental side of it, I think.
No, I think we saw Dutch architecture twice last year. We saw two kinds of Dutch architecture last semester. We saw one which were what we'll call the Amsterdam School, which is the like these red brick, like beautiful housing complexes, but also with a similar ethic, I think, as Aldo van Eyck, is that those were buildings that were meant for public realm was important. They were softer buildings. They were caring about people. They were those kinds. And we saw the other extreme. We saw the style, which were these, I don't know whether you guys remember Mondrian and Rietveld and all of those sorts of check houses, which of course then later on become the inspiration for Eisenman. So we saw two kinds of Dutch architects actually last semester.
And some public buildings as well, right? Like larger scale public buildings.
Yeah, I think we saw them during while we were looking at the abstract. At the expressionist only, at the red Amsterdam, not red Amsterdam, but red brick Amsterdam. Red Vienna is another story entirely. Which we didn't do, na? Shirish, we never did Vienna, na?
With them, I don't think we did Red Vienna. No, but this projects that we are talking about, whether it be Piet Blom or we think of Aldo van Eyck, most certainly one is their sort of consciousness to the everyday and how people use spaces, and the other is their awareness that these are spaces within a city. For me, that is a very important learning. Actually, when we were in school, one of the first things when we were looking at Aldo van Eyck's was some of his other works that were very much conscious about the place of the individual in the city. And when I look at Piet Blom's project also, I'm reminded of that kind of consciousness and awareness that the building has to create some kind of integration with where it is situated, with the surrounding, with the kind of context that the urban is providing, and it has to work with and for that.
Should we move to today, Shiru?
Yep. Yes.
All right, people. Where am I? Here. This was last week. This is this week. Again, Team 10. Sorry, I need to go to the first slide now. Yeah. It's called participation. That's today's theme for today's lecture. Just to go back to that infamous chart that we're going to be following through, we're still in here, Team 10. This is what we are looking at. And it's in here that we saw both the work of the Brutalists and we saw the Dutch people that we saw last week. Today we are going to follow another group of people who were also part of Team 10, which means that they went for the meetings and met regularly and had long discussions around questions concerning architecture after the end of Siam. One of the most important one of those is a man called Giancarlo De Carlo. Giancarlo De Carlo, and like his name sounds, he was from Italy. And he was actually one of the first members of Team 10. And one of the articles he wrote was called Architecture's Public. And this Architecture's Public as an article was written in 1969, which is 10 years after Team 10 actually started, within which he really articulated his own position with respect to what architecture should be doing and the places that architecture seems to have failed substantially. And that famous statement that Ola Baumann also kind of quoted during his keynote lecture that says that architecture has become too important to be left to the architects is actually something that Giancarlo De Carlo had also first said. one of the important things that he says when he says this is that which fundamentally means that architects cannot be the only ones who make decisions concerning the world of people in the way people live. He meant that people need to participate in the processes within which architecture is being through which architecture emerges. And here he says a very important thing. But identifying with the user's needs does not mean planning for them. That means you don't go about kind of doing 20 interviews and you come back and say, "Achha, main ab design karungi kyunki I have understood these people." Is to say, but planning with them. In other words, it means enlarging the field of participation through the definition and use of the plan, introducing into the system a whole set of complex variables which could never be composed into balanced situations. So he's acknowledging the fact that when you do participation, it's never going to be like one good plan. It's going to be constantly chaotic. There are going to be lots of changes. Everything is going to be in many ways much more complex. So the only thing we can do is we can put in place procedural systems based on a continual alternation of, this is an important statement, let's read that again, procedural systems based on a continual alternation of observations, propositions and evaluations. So he says that ये plan का जो fixity है, जो finalization है, we don't need to be sticking to that. What we need to do is set up a system, and it's within the system that things will constantly change. You can see a similar sort of ethic that even emerges within the Dutch structuralists, who say that it's not about the plan, but it's about the system. And in their case, the system was the grids, in the case of Hertzberger and people like that, right? But in Giancarlo De Carlo's case, he's trying to involve much more proactively the users who are going to be using the spaces themselves. More quotations from Giancarlo De Carlo. Everyone knows that modern architecture started life in a climate of deep political and social commitment, and that very few traces of that climate remain today. Today obviously meant the 1960s. This is an important thing because in many ways, he's not against modern architecture. He says that modern architecture jab shuru hua tha, then it had a political and social commitment. But he believes that by the 1950s and the 60s, ye jo social or political commitment tha of the architects in the early modern era had all disappeared. And all that was left was, something that looks modern, but really did not have any political commitment at all. And it's something that I think can resonate even today in much of the work that we are seeing around us. Another quotation is, professionals are against participation because it destroys the arcane privileges of specialization, unveils the professional secret, strips bare incompetence, multiplies responsibilities, and converts them from the private into the social. Academic communities are against it because participation nullifies all the schemes on which teaching and research are based. So fundamentally saying कि ये participation का जो फंडा है, that threatens professionals because they feel कि if people are participating, फिर हमारा role क्या है? And academic people like architecture schools like us, we are also against ideas of participation because it fundamentally says कि हमारा जो basis है upon which we are teaching you, okay, that itself is completely gone for a toss. So he's saying, so he's kind of trying to say that that's why participation is something that architectural professions and academies find it difficult to engage with. And the third quotation, the essential purpose of architecture is to organize and shape space for use, to consign it to individual and collective experience, to expose it to the effects of time so that it ages, becomes stratified, continues to be enriched with meanings, until at a certain point it begins to design and redesign itself, seemingly by its own volition, to endure and hand down the most eloquent record of human events. Here he's very much talking about time. He's saying that architects tend to design objects like buildings to stay permanent, fixed, and like unchanging across time. And he says, yeah, people change, things change, communities change, and architecture should also design and redesign itself as the world changes. And that then architecture itself will become a reminder of all the various things that have happened in the world. Let's look at one of his most famous works. This is the town of Urbino. On the left, you're seeing where the old town is. And on the right, this entire thing you're seeing is a campus of the University of Urbino. And what Giancarlo De Carlo did is that in a period of 20 years, like 62 to 83, he created 4 hostel facilities for this campus. Now, one of the important things that he did is that, and each of these 4 are in many ways connected to one another, but they all straddle this incredible hill, connected to but outside the old city of Urbino. The important thing is the way that he saw the old city. The classic modernists would treat the old city as something to be shunned, to be ridiculed, usko nikal do, right? But instead of that, what Giancarlo De Carlo does is that he says this: the historical city is not considered as a collection of artifacts, not a museum. Instead, the history and the fabric of the traditional city is understood as an important aspect of the present condition that had to be considered and incorporated into the continued evaluation of Urbino. So he sees his campus literally as an extension of the old city, as a respectful extension of the old city. And we'll see how he's really working that out in the project itself. This is the master plan of it. This is the road that comes in from Urbino, and this entire set here on this hill, you can see the contours cascading downwards. These are the buildings that Giancarlo De Carlo added to the campus over a period of 20 years. And he really conceived of this as an integral part of the town of Urbino. For example, in this quotation, he says, the university must be an active, open part of society of the town, towards which it has both its rights and duties. Usually it takes its rights, but it is less concerned with its duties. Just as the university is using the city and its territory, in the same way, the university should also reciprocate and be usable by the city and its territory. So he's saying कि ये boundary जो रहता है city का और university का, उसे तोड़ देना चाहिए. As much as the city gives to the university should also be giving to the city. So he creates programs within this campus, but also within the city that brings university learning right into the heart of the city. And we'll see one such project like that. This master plan, I'm just showing it to you again. These are the 4 hostels, A, B, C, and D. And this is a central sort of administrative building that's here. Yeah. I'm going to literally kind of zoom through the buildings themselves. You can see the buildings as they cascade down using the contours moving downwards, while some are working against the contour, which means they're cascading downwards. Some of them are straddling a contour, giving views to the valley across. You can see this central kind of other one which is encircled by the hostels. And in between all of that are these plazas from which you get these extraordinary views of the building. If you look at the materiality of the project, these are not materials that are very expensive. These are easily built, cheaply built perhaps. If you remember the Hunstanton School by Peter and Alison Smithson, a similar sort of idea of exposed concrete, exposed brick, straightforward materials being used to create an architecture. These are the internal spaces of gathering. These are all done, all these designs were done in collaboration with student communities as well as faculty communities to come up with the ideas that would determine the architecture. You can see that there are many sorts of spaces for informal gathering that then break open from the hostel facilities, from the university facilities themselves. I'm not going to talk too much about this. I'm just going to go across the images a little bit. This is the hostel room itself with that incredible view across the valley to the other side. The scale of the building is controlled and soft. It breaks down into these tinier sorts of units that in many ways are similar to the size of a traditional house that might be there within Urbino. In the master plan, you can even see the replication to some extent of the terraces and the streets and the squares of a traditional Italian town. This is the central sort of community center from where you see that you come down from the administration to the community center, and you have these buildings that are encircling and kind of running along the contour itself. And within there is, of course, a cascading series of levels that are helping the building mediate with the ground that it's sitting The hostel rooms themselves, all of them with the circulation at the back so that the view to the valley is uninterrupted. I just have lots of photos, so I'm just going to show you the photos. The hostel rooms themselves again. These bridges and internal spaces that are there part of the project. Plazas overlooking the water. Same plaza that we saw earlier. Somehow this reminds me a little bit of the Aldo van Eyck orphanage and the interior of it with its circular spaces of waiting, rectangular geometries, etc. The next project of his that we'll be looking at is again designed for the same University of Urbino, but it's not within the Urbino campus. It's in fact right in the heart of the city. This is the walled city of Urbino. You see the road that runs along the wall. This climbs up, and you see this green patch here that is inserted into this fabric, and that is the project that that Giancarlo Di Carlo did. It's actually a series of smaller programs that include, I think, some. There's a library. There's some rooms for professors. There's some seminar rooms, etc. that are part of this program. Yeah. If you look at the plan, there are three parts to the plan. And there seems to be one which is actually simply replicates almost, because it looks like this building is part of this, but this is actually part of Giancarlo Di Carlo's kind of thing. All of this stuff. It replicates the fabric of Urbino itself. There's a circular cutout around which there are the professors' rooms, and there is this sort of arc of a courtyard with a terrace overlooking the arc. That is really where the library is. You can see it even over here in the way that the building itself sits within the large town of Urbino as it's cascading down. And this is the you can see the guy sitting on top from the terrace. This is the glass that brings in the light into the main teaching spaces that are there here at the back. From the street, the building literally has no, I mean, it just could be any other building. It uses almost the same architectural language as the fabric itself. It doesn't claim to also stand out. This is from within. This is the circular courtyard around which they are the offices of the professors. This is the external wall, one of these external walls from where you can look out. This is the plan. As you can see, all of these are the buildings that replicate the fabric that is directly around it, and all of them are tinier rooms that are there around here. This is the circular cutout from where you see all these professors' rooms are overlooking and getting light from this internal courtyard. You come inside here and you have the circulation space. These are the teaching spaces. You can see the classrooms that are all drawing in light from this courtyard. In the section, you can see the way that the building steps down to match the scale of the street as it's meeting this particular street. So it goes down, then goes back up again, makes this larger courtyard for the professors, steps up again. On this side as well, it kind of controls the scale of the street. You see the same here. The scale of the street is short, so it kind of cascades downwards. This is the cutout that's bringing in light all the way down into the basement here. A project that he did for for a steel company, and it's a housing project for the steel company, where he was doing housing for the workers, and he insisted on evolving a long participative process through which this housing would emerge. Long interviews were held with the workers about what their desires are, what their needs are. It was through that he evolved individual sort of housing types, and each of these housing types catered to the specific requirements of that particular family. One of the important things I felt that he did is that, you know, all the time that the workers gave to the actual process of design was compensated by the company itself. So they weren't taking time out of their free time to do this. They were involved in every part of the design process and were paid for that. And I think that was an important intervention within this project. This project is quite straightforward. It's a series of ground plus 3 buildings on two sides, and there are bridges that reach across from one side to the other. So this is one side, the other side, and there are bridges that reach across, making kind of cutting the housing block into a community spaces as they're running through. Terraced apartments again, individual terraces for the workers to grow things in. This is designed almost at the same time as Charles Correa's LIC colony where I lived in and from which I made Lovely Villa. And I can see so many of the ideas resonate in both the projects, especially these sorts of streets that run through the two bars of housing, the terraces, the midway sorts of spaces, the transition spaces as community spaces that can be found in both projects. But of course, Giancarlo De Carlo is doing it as a participatory process. Well, I don't think Charles Correa was. The space in between, which is lush green as a place to live in. Another view of the terrace. The next person that we'll be looking at is a man called Ralph Erskine. I don't think he was as deeply involved with Team 10 as Giancarlo De Carlo, but since his work is also happening at the same time and really is also very interested in questions of participation, we thought we'll put him within this lecture as well. Erskine was actually British, but spent most of his life in Sweden and did a lot of his work in Sweden. One of his earlier works is his house actually, and house and studio, and it's actually a very, very simple house and studio. It's made in prefabricated concrete. Again, there's no attempt to make complex or very high-end materials as really forming the aesthetic of the building. It's through the use of the ordinary materials that the aesthetic of the building emerges. Also, the use of very straightforward architectural forms and techniques. It's a very simple building and it's deceptively simple. It just looks like a simple barn, like these prefabricated kind of things with the rounded corners on the edges, windows that are punched into the thing, and a courtyard at the center. These are the two parts. One of them is the studio, the other one is the home. Literally like this. That's the plan. That's the courtyard that we saw in the earlier image. And this is the plan. And if you look at the plan, you come in from here. It's from here that you come inside the space. The living space is here, and there's a cascading kind of leveling that goes up into the inside. The kitchen is over here, right? This is ground plus one. This is just ground story. You come inside from here. This is the main office space. You can see the tables arranged. And I love this drawing because of the fact that it is really interested in showing the nature of the flooring in the open spaces and how things change and how flooring itself became part of the way that the experience of the building was imagined. The upper floor plan on the right side, which is the housing area where you go up, and this is a double height that we'll see in some of the later photographs. This is the double heighted living space. You can kind of look down from here, the kitchen, etc., tucked underneath. This I assume is the office space on the other side. Oh no, this is the same room cut in the section this way, because you can see the mid-level split level that is there. And the inside, especially, I felt was representative of the embrace of everyday life that you see in the work of Ralph Erskine. Which is that things like everyday life is just allowed to be there. I love the way that the photographs themselves are taken with things that are hanging, dust cloths, things on this. It looks like it's being used. It doesn't look like most other images of architecture, which tends to clean everything up until all that you're supposed to see is space and light and shadow and form. You're seeing the stuff that makes up our everyday lives as very much part of the architecture, as you can see within this image. I don't know whether you guys remember the images of the Eames house that we saw in one of the last lectures of last year. But this, in many ways, reminds me of that Eames house aesthetic, which is that it consists of the stuff of everyday life becoming part of the architecture itself. So I'm going to go over more images. And then we can just see the way that the building itself is. More images.
Rohan, there are similar images of Alto's house also, if you remember.
Yeah, right, absolutely.
Where the aesthetic on the inside is very similar.
Yeah, yeah, the Villa Mairia, yeah, that one, yeah, very similar. This is the split level from top where you kind of come down into the living space. External views with an organized but a sort of easygoing informality about the way that the windows are punched into the wall, and the grid of the concrete itself forms the grid into which the windows are punched in. Now we're going to go through a few projects that were, I think, largely speculated. This is called the Arctic Town, and it's imagined as a home or like a city that can be built in the Arctic. 1958, 1959 is when Siam disbanded. So it's look at the way that the building is. It's like a large wall that is wrapping around like an embrace, and inside which there is a whole community that exists. And you see that in many of the drawings as well. This idea of the walled home, like a community that's embraced by architecture itself. And the wall serves the purpose of keeping out the wind, actually, because the wind then, which is a high kind of wind that happens in the Arctic Circle, the wind would then kind of be protected, would go above, so that the community itself would then be protected from the harsh winds. You see that in many of the drawings. I love these drawings, which really are kind of little doodles about trying to learn from Eskimo shelters, and the way that bears live, hibernating, and thinking about using land itself as an earth berm to protect the homes and insulate the homes within colder climates. These drawings here, you can see the drawings kind of doing that, the sectional drawings that are part of his process. He got a chance to design a version of that. It's something called Resolute Bay, which was in Canada. And it was partly a shelter for indigenous communities and also partly a place for scientific research, meteorological research, etc. So you see a similar sort of idea that's very much part of the external wall made in these incredible colors, and the internal community that's protected, that opens itself out onto a lake, and houses. And you can see the house types that were imagined. That would be tiny little kinds of hexagons that would all cluster together within the protection of the wall outside. Another image of the same thing. And this is photos of, I guess, parts of it. (1970). So between 1958 and 1970. Okay, that is Arctic Bay to Resolute Bay. But the project that actually we'll be looking at, that spanned almost that entire length, is actually from 1969 to 1982, and is probably his most famous and largest work. It's called the Byker Wall. It's in England, and if you look at the building, you see this long black line that's here. That long black line is what is called the Byker Wall, and everything within it are other housing projects that are in some way sheltered by that large Byker Wall, very similar to what you're seeing even within Resolute Bay, is Resolute Bay designs. Go through some images. You see the wall from the sky as a wrapper around, and within this is all kind of low-rise housing projects that are sheltered. Another image here. And what it's sheltering from in this case is not the cold, icy tundra wind, but rather the pollution and noise that comes from a freeway. So what the building does, it builds a wall against that freeway and has all the housing then protected at the back behind it. And the wall itself is like this. It's this brick wall made in different colors with patterns, ornament, very like, it's like this, it's like fabric. The ornament in some ways, where the bricks, different colors of brick make patterns on the surface. The outside wall is also far muscular, very less windows that break that wall, and you see the way that it's creased. The wall is creased like that, and inside and within that you have these low-rise housing complexes that are part of it. We'll be descending soon, so don't worry. Another aerial view of the Byker Wall. inside the wall. And there's an existing church that the building kind of comes down and kind of starts deferring to, breaks the large wall up so that it becomes softer. And the wall is on the outside. This is the inside of it. You see the section here where you have this wall that's here, and within which there's this really low rise housing colonies. So while the outside wall is much harder, the inside wall is full of balconies and transformations. Each of these was, it was said, there was a level of participation that allowed user groups to participate in personalizing much of what their units were like. So this is a section, you see that wall that runs across, and then there is one tall high-rise unit that we will see photos of a little later on. This is the inside again. Very pretentious details of both benches, doors, windows, chapras, whatever. Very straightforward kinds of uses of these things. It's a very straightforward plan, so you don't need to kind of go too much into the plan. Views of the architecture. This again, if you remember, the Streets in the Sky from Peter and Alison Switson. These are versions of this. This is the block at the end of the wall. An easygoing informality on the inside and a monumental wall on the outside. That's generally what I would summarize, I guess, the biker wall lies. Tiny little openings through which you punch the wall to go to the other side. The last architect we'll be looking at today is a man called Lucien Kroll, who's from Belgium. And again, I don't know what his real relationship with the Team 10 really is. But his work, again, is within the same time frame and is really interested in breaking the monolithic imagination of architectural production by involving user participation as an integral part of the way that architecture emerges. So he is constantly trying to destroy the top-down imagination of architecture. One of his most popular buildings or projects, actually, I don't think I can call it a building, is this one, which is again 1968. And 1968 is a very important year, and we'll come upon that year over and over again. 1968 is the year when across Europe, and especially in France, there were violent student protests against societal norms. And that 1968 is considered to be a watershed of workers' rights, students' rights, a lot of things. It's the end of the 60s. And 1968 is also the year that Lucien Kroll begins work on this project, which is a student housing project, where he directly involves student groups in conversations, trying to create an architecture. And he says that the architecture, rather than being hard, should be soft like a sponge. It should be able to soak in the different desires, needs, and aspirations of the people who are living there. And he tries to create an architecture that can react intimately with those needs, whether that's in the color of paint or the addition of a room or whatever sorts of idiosyncrasies that the community who lives in there would like to add to the building. Joyce has some more images. So there is, in some ways, for me, this reminded me a little of the Erskine interiors with its sort of easy informality. Another image of a medical student housing. I don't know whether it's the same. I don't know his work very, very well because I've never had the opportunity to visit it, but I've heard a lot about it, so I thought it's important thing to show you. Shirish, have you any familiarity with Kroll's work?
No, but Rohan, from what I have read, he was very clear that if there is no client, there will be no architecture. Meaning, to give you an example, he was not willing to design for developers. Okay, he didn't want to create a housing and then take it to people where then people can buy and start to reside. His approach was that no, if there's a client for whom I'm building the house, then that's the origin of architecture. Okay, meaning he was against this idea of speculation. He was against the idea of kind of builder-driven models of architecture fundamentally. And so a lot of his projects are long-term projects. They are not the kind of quick, like housing banaya abhi ho gaya, you know. So they're long-term projects where incrementally, slowly, parts have been added. New people have wanted more spaces and things like that. So that's what I've heard. I think we have a book in the library now.
Yeah.
So we should do a little bit more research on his works.
This is another project that he did for a church community where this is the large barn that has just simply been converted into a community space just by adding a skylight. So a lot of the works is sometimes not very क्या बोलते हैं वो strict or finished. It's all rather added on, made makeshift things that are in some senses impermanent, you know, and that allow things to transit. This is the plan of that community. So again, if you see the way that the housing itself emerges, whether that's the relationship of the older building with the new, there's a conscious attempt to keep the scale of it as something that it does not dominate the overall community. This is a project which is a project in it's a place called, it was never built, or maybe part of it was built in a place called Persienne. I don't know how to pronounce that, somewhere in France, I guess, where these were existing buildings that were there. And the idea was to kind of treat every building as if it was, you know, like look at this image on top, where every building is actually made up of different homes that can then come together to form the larger type. So what he did is that he then took an existing building type and started working with the people, with the community who lives there, and started creating additions and subtractions, new floors, you know, things that kind of get added on to the older block itself to create a building that would in many ways respond closely to the needs of the community. So there is definitely an anti, how should I put it, geometry, anti-organized, anarchic, if you want to call it that, nature to the work that Kroll does. This is one corner of it where he added, where you see the older plan, which is there below here, where there's one unit here and you kind of come inside. The lower floor gets broken up. He starts creating new space. There are two flats now within a floor, and this is what he does. He adds a little room, he adds a floor, and you know, again, like Erskine, uses surface tile work, surface images to start breaking the large monolith of the block to make it more scaled to the human body. Yeah. So the block then becomes a little like this. Lots of so this is really, as much as this is about architecture, this is also about the way that a community is built, the way that a community is spoken to. It's a social service, social science, economics, and architecture very closely related to each other.
Yeah, these drawings are so fascinating. Rohan, can you go back to the earlier one?
This one, yeah.
You suddenly find that the building roof, the extensions of the backyard, foyards, all of these becoming part of that architecture. You know, so it's not seen as something which is like that. This is the building, and no, that's an important aspect of the building. How you are appropriating those spaces as well. I find these drawings very fascinating.
I think there are many. If you take this narrative down, you know, sites and services projects, you know, what is called informal housing, all of the power of each of these also come to the forefront. If you think about, if you don't think about architecture as something that is fixed and definite, but think of architecture more as a process that is more integral and intimately connected with everyday life. You know, that's the way that this is emerging. Shirish, you were saying something, were you?
No, I was just thinking. I was thinking that including the LIC colony by Charles Correa, I'm thinking of other projects like the Belapur housing, which is done. Okay, where the role of the architect is in suggesting the scheme and giving it a formal dimension, but not necessarily sort of enforcing a completeness. You know. Like I find that even the LIC colony, if you look at the overall kind of master plan, it has the ability to grow more. You know, it is not closed as a system, and that is where it allows it to be built on a terrain. It allows you to build on a flatter ground. It has flexibility sort of embedded, and I find that quite fascinating. I'm just also reminded of the fact that when we were in school, very often when we used to work in the night and wake up early in the morning, we used to find Doshi coming to the building and taking photographs of that building. Okay, and the school building. And and later on we were revealed that he has been doing this for years. He's documenting the building through all its changes for the last 30, 40 years. Okay, so there's something fascinating about that as well. That you're learning as an architect constantly by the changes that people are making, whether it is people are hammering the walls, they're hanging things, whatever it is, but that's part of the life of the architecture. Yeah.
So, there's always this sort of thing, I think we'll talk a little bit more about this, especially when we're discussing an essay maybe next semester called Can the Subaltern Speak? Who says that, people said that, of course, Kroll was manipulating the people who are speaking to so that he gets what they want. He gets what he wants from them. And this is Kroll's reply. And I think it's an interesting reply. They are obviously right, people who said that we were manipulating them. But we forgot that exchange, the inhabitants were manipulating us also. They were certainly wrong to imagine that if we had been mute photocopiers, the inhabitants would have designed houses in the shape of Mickey Mouse or boots. Okay, they projected their own myths. The real inhabitants showed themselves more responsible and more careful. So he's saying कि ऐसे होता है when one is having a conversation with somebody or one is talking to somebody, it's especially when there's a power equation. In this case, the design with one who is being designed for. The way that power works is complicated because the people that you're talking to are also manipulating you as much as you are in some senses trying to convince them in some way. So that power dynamic is something that is that I find just because Lucian Kroll acknowledges the fact that there is a kind of complicated power relationship that is there here. And he sees himself as this. So this is an interesting thing I felt. Okay, he writes, to order is a military act, to motivate is to be responsible and responsive and responsible. So he's saying that the role of the architect here is not merely to make order, to put things in place, but really to motivate people to participate in a conversation and to respond to that conversation and be responsible with the power that is there in one's hands. And I think that is the way that he would put it. And I think that's an interesting thing because it reminded me of that quotation that I use when we are discussing the subaltern quotation by Spivak that we very often kind of go back to, which is to non-coercively rearrange desire. And we'll come to that later on. But this idea that one in a conversation during participation to start thinking about ways in which architects can non-coercively rearrange the desires of not only they're speaking to, but also their own desires. Okay, this is what we looked at today, just to kind of do a quick summary. Giancarlo De Carlo, working during this time, the Urbino works, that's all that we looked at. This is all the Urbino works and the Matteotti neighborhood that we saw. Architecture's Public is that famous essay that he's written that should be read. Erskine's work, this green wall from 1956 with his own house outside Stockholm, right up to the biker wall, which I put in 1969, but really continues all the way across up to 1982. And two projects by Lucian Kroll built immediately after the Red Line. The Red Line are the kind of student riots in Paris. One is the student housing, and the other one is that Dominican Center that we saw, right? This is where we were. We are still in that same period of time. The world has been decolonized. The Vietnam War is raging. You have Stalin is dead, and in the 1960s you have the possibilities of a new world emerging because you have the Civil Rights Act, queer rights, the women's rights, all of those things are happening in this particular period. And it is in that climate that you see this move towards trying to get people to participate more, a more democratic way in which architecture itself can emerge as a direct challenge to the way that something like, let's say, Chandigarh or Brasilia were designed. Next week, we will be going across the world to Japan and looking at some Japanese metabolism. I'll stop sharing now. We need to pick 4 people for next week, don't we?
Yeah, let's do that. Where is the list? Okay, so today's, or rather next classes are Neil, Rutik, Kshitij, Tanvi, and Abhidnya. 5 of them.
Chalo. Can
Neil,
you
have
put cameras on,
Kshitijs.
please? Neil?
sorry,
We have 2 Kshitijs.
this is Kshitij Shuri.
Kshitij, Shuri, please turn your
Shuri.
camera on.
Rutik,
Rutik,
Neil.
please turn your camera on. Hi, Rutik. Nice
Okay,
to see you.
Neil.
Hi.
Okay, I can see Abhidnya and Tanvi. Okay.
Hello.
And who did I miss? Neil, Rutik, Kshitij, Tanvi, Abhidnya.
So what you
have-
guys have to do is you have to I mean, I don't know what you all want to do. You all can talk amongst each other and you all can arrange the first 10 minutes. You all can speak to your class, see whether people have something specific to ask. Okay, some clarifications, some anger, whatever. They can say anything they like and you all can curate that, and the first 10-15 minutes are yours next class. All right?
Yeah.
Okay.
But Ron, I suggest that also the entire class not look at only the examples that we show.
Yeah.
And do a little bit of a search of on these architects and their other works also. You know, it's not possible for us to actually give you a complete overview of the architect's work. Okay, we in these lectures that Rohan is showing, he's choosing to bring certain examples because they fall in that group of collection. You know, but that doesn't mean that their body of work does not have other aspects and things. And that is this we are hoping is a way for you to enter into their works. You know, rather
Enter
than
not only
just
into their works, but enter also into that period.
that period.
And all the other ideas that were there, you know, because
Yeah.
these ideas have not been restricted only to that period or only to that geography. Ideas of participation, for example, have been deeply kind of part of things that are affecting us today as well. So,
Yeah.
and that goes for everything. These are only examples because at one level this is a history lecture as well as a theory lecture. So it's because of that that we are placing it within this time. You know?
Yeah.
Okay. Chal.
Okay.
Bye, people. See you guys.
All right. See you guys. Ron, wait. You will have to download attendance.
I'll download attendance. Okay.
Send it to me. Say, Shravan.
So, I mean, it's kind of very out of proportion in that sense, but I was wondering if there's any starting point I could use when I'm like researching Portuguese architecture in Vasai, because I've been trying to find more architectural articles, but I can only find like news articles on stuff like it.
Heras Institute in Xavier's College.
All right.
That is the place which has connected a lot of information on the Portuguese history. I don't know how much of it is directly architectural, but it is the place where you'll find a lot. And the other person you can speak to is Ainsley Lewis, because he works with the church quite a bit in and has also built a museum, designed a museum in Goregaon East, I think, which is looking at artifacts from Portuguese history. So
yeah, and Apurva Iyengar.
Yeah, Apurva Iyengar.
Yeah. Her thesis was Vasai Fort, so she would have a lot of information.
Yeah, because I actually came up in conversation with someone and now I'm actually interested. Like I was just getting into it to impress someone, but now I'm like actually interested in the whole sport history.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay. And one was coming, but the timelines are starting to sound like verses of like we didn't start the fires over time.
Yeah.
You can make a new song with all these. Yeah, Ron, you have the attendance.
I sent it to you.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
All right.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
I need to go back to Tokyo Drift.
Bye.
Yeah, that's a good choice. For the first.
Thank you.
Thank you.